Okay. Hello, friends. We are so glad that you're joining us here today for another episode of the Revelation Wellness Podcast. Today, I am joined by Beth Guckenberger. Did I say that right, Beth?
You sure did. Sounds
Okay.
great.
Perfect. So we're joined today by Beth. Beth has written 11 books. She served as a missionary, a speaker. She's the co-executive director of Back to Back Ministries, which is a ministry that serves orphans through holistic care. Beth's a wife and a mama, and her latest book is called Throw the First Punch, which is about helping us be prepared each and every day for the schemes and tactics of the enemy. So we're super excited that you said yes to joining us here today. Thanks for being here.
No, thanks for having me. I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, so today, one of the things that we're going to be talking about is your new book, which I'm
Mhm,
excited to hear more about that. But it's on a topic that a lot of people may not be super comfortable with. And
mhm,
so, really looking forward to hearing you kind of unpack with us why it's important that we are aware and observant of spiritual warfare and how that is being used in our lives. As I was preparing today, I was thinking about Ephesians 6:12, and we know that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but sometimes we make it about flesh and blood. And
mhm.
so, really glad that you're here today to share this with us. So, with that, how about you just jump right in and tell us a little bit about your new book?
Oh, thanks for all that intro. Yeah, I grew up in the church. So, as a little kid, I made armors of God. And then,
Yeah, right.
I was a college kid when Frank Peretti's books came out about This Present
Mhm.
Darkness and Piercing the
Mhm.
Darkness. And my imagination was stoked a little bit about what goes on in a world we can't see. And then
Yeah.
I became a missionary in 1997 and moved to another country and had some experiences that I realize now I could have had in my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio, but I just didn't have the radar up. I didn't have the
Yeah.
discernment to understand.
Right.
And as I was seeking out answers to circumstances and situations that didn't necessarily have human explanation to them, I
Mm.
was I was finding that a lot of the content written about spiritual warfare was kind of from the fringes of our faith community. People
Right.
who thought maybe the devil's behind every door, when sometimes we get potholes. I mean, we get flat tires because there's a pothole, and we get sick because we were exposed to germs. Like the devil's not
Totally.
actually behind everything.
Totally. Okay.
Or it was on the other side, and it was like, it's the enemy only lives in one place at a time, which is true, and it's probably not your house. So what you're experiencing is just about you and your
Right.
own struggles and issues. And I was like, and I learned that about a quarter of what Jesus said was about things that we can't see, about a world in which we can't see. And that
Wow.
started to feel like a really good
Wow.
ratio. Like, you don't want to talk about it all the time because I don't want to give undue attention to an enemy. But if I
Right.
never talk about it, then he gets to get away with things. So about a quarter of the time kind of seemed like a good ratio. And
Yeah,
then,
I'd never heard that before. A quarter of the time.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And then in the start of 2020, right at the very beginning of COVID, um, I got a phone call from a large church in my city that I had been speaking at once or twice a year for 10 or 15 years. And they lost their pastor that week and had just gone online because we had all just gone online for church.
Right.
And they wanted someone who was familiar to the congregation to be on the screen when they turned it on. So they asked me if I would serve as the interim senior pastor. And I'd never been a
Oh,
pastor before. I never thought
yeah.
about being a pastor before, but it was the start of COVID. We were all kind of doing hard things. And so
Right.
I said, okay, sure. And I
Put
was
me
in
in.
this, I was in this staff meeting, about 75 staff at this church, big church. And I had an agenda that I had prepared. And about 15 minutes into the meeting, it just wasn't going the way I thought it would. And finally, I just pushed my paper away and I said, listen, people, I am not
Mm,
the only person with an agenda in the room. We have
mm,
an enemy, and his agenda is to disrupt God's kids doing God's work in God's house.
yeah.
And if just use your imagination with me for a minute, what do we think the enemy wants to have happen in this room today? What's on his agenda? And
Wow.
one brave lady goes, I think he'd want us not to trust you. And I was like, yes. And I rolled over this whiteboard and I wrote distrust. And then somebody's like, I think you'd want us to be so afraid we don't know what to do. And I wrote fear. And anyway, the room continued to populate with the kinds of things we imagined the enemy wanted to have happen in this
Yeah,
church. And at the end, I looked at the board and I said, he doesn't have any new tricks. Everything he knows how to do, we've already seen before.
that's right.
And I've read my Bible plenty. I know Ephesians 6 says I put on the full armor of God. I know First Peter 5 says there's an enemy, he's like a lion and he's
Yes.
prowling around.
Yes.
The problem is when I put those two teachings together, I get the impression I'm supposed to put my armor on and wait for the lion to come get me. But if I already know all the stuff he's going to do, why does he get to come get me? I'd actually
Mm,
like to go
come
get him
on.
first.
Come on. Come on.
So that's where that title comes from, about throwing the first punch. Like, I don't need to be in a responsive posture. I need to be in an aggressive posture. And when I said that to that room and I said, let's go take out the enemy before he has a chance to come in here and disrupt what God's doing here,
I love that.
lots of things changed. And then I started to talk about that in my marriage. And then we have 11 children. I started talking about it with my family. And then I was like, you know what? I think this is a thing. Like, I think I just need to take a minute and say, what would the enemy want to happen? And what do I need to do to preempt his activity?
Wow.
And it's caused me to feel bolder in
Yeah,
ways.
yeah.
And the book is just a whole bunch of stories of what happened in the aftermath of that.
I love that. I love that you just brought it to the light, right? Because
Hmm.
sometimes we can feel it, but we can't necessarily explain it, or we don't stop to take the time to
Hmm.
explain it and to be sober minded about what's actually happening. I love that. So good. Okay, so 2020, obviously, you were saying it was birthed kind of in the middle of all of that. That's a time that a lot of people were experiencing just a lot of anxiety and fear. At Rev, we talk a lot about how does that land in our bodies, and we're not called to have a spirit of fear, but sometimes we get stuck in these cycles, right? So we have
Hmm.
to interrupt that to break out of it. So I guess my question for you is, you kind of sensed the room as you were sitting there, but for people who are listening today,
Hmm.
what would that look like, right? And
Hmm.
specifically in regards to anxiety or fear being used as a tool in spiritual warfare,
Hmm.
how do we recognize that? How do we call that out? What would it look like for us?
Yeah, those are great. Those are great questions. I think if you can think of a progression or a spectrum, like the first step of that is I feel afraid about something. It could be something in my history, my present. It could be anxiety about an unknown future, whatever. Like, I'm having fear.
Yeah.
If I don't deal with that fear, I don't confess that, get accountability, replace that fear with truth, do the work around that fear,
Yes.
then the Bible talks about how that fear can get a foothold in my heart, in my
Right.
mind.
Right.
And I can take that apart. I mean, spiritual discipline and um, just even, deliverance from that can happen. But if I don't do any work and I just let that little foothold go unchecked, over time, the next step in that progression is the Bible talks about strongholds. It becomes a
Yes.
stronghold and it becomes like my default way of thinking. It becomes
Right.
a like muscle memory. I get really comfortable and familiar with feeling that way, and I don't fight it anymore because the last step in that progression is becomes a part of my identity, and I think this is just who I am. And
Right.
instead of having worried about something, I'm now a warrior.
Yes.
Or
Right.
if it happens with any kind of sin, if the first sin I do is I lie and then I don't do anything about that lie, and lying becomes one of my protective strategies, and it gets a little foothold in my heart, and then over time it becomes a stronghold. Now, instead of having lied once, I am a liar. I
Mm-hmm.
am a deceiver of people, and
Mm-hmm.
that becomes a part of my identity. So I think
Yes.
one of the healthy things we can do is confess our sin on a regular basis. I mean, I was a part of a confessional group maybe 10 years ago for the first time, and in that we were confessing sins people couldn't see. So there's all kinds of sins I do that people can see, but there are some
Yes.
sins that nobody sees, like
Right.
envy
Right.
or lust or all kinds of sins in there that go on in my mind. And I remember one time I was confessing the sin of judgment, which is not a sin anybody would see. It's just between the Lord and I.
Yes.
And the freedom that resulted in
Mm.
confessing that's like actually saying it out loud, hearing how
Mhm.
ugly it sounds,
Mhm.
understanding what it's done to my relationships, understanding what it's done to
Mhm.
my attitude towards people, like really just pulling it out of the dark and putting it on the table, then that's how you start to dismantle strongholds and footholds. And
Yes.
suddenly now I'm like, I am not judgmental. That's not my identity. It is a sin I can still struggle with, but it's not who I am
That's
anymore.
right.
And
Not who you are. Yes.
there's some freedom, some really good freedom that can come with
Yeah.
the act of confession and the act of, so whether it's fear and anxiety or whatever struggle someone who's listening to it is wrestling with, I think God gives us good tools so we can experience freedom in those areas.
I think what typically happens is we feel like we can just hide it, right? We're the only ones. The enemy makes us think we're the only one that struggles with this thing, and we can dress it up and try to make it look nice, or, even kind of set up a little display in our hearts as if you would in your home. And we say, well, this is just something that I do. We're the only ones, and no one can know. But there's this beautiful invitation instead to just run right back to the Father and say, I need to bring this to the light, because when we do that, the enemy loses his hold and there's
Hmm.
healing and freedom there. Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. Okay, so in your book, you have an acronym that you use. So
Hmm.
it's the acronym COMBAT, and you're
Hmm.
you're using it. Well, why don't you tell us? Kind of walk us through that and how we can use that.
Yeah, I was thinking about, as I was talking to people and even reflecting in my own life about spiritual attack, I was looking for some common denominators. And most people were saying, like, I get stuck. I feel frozen. I don't know what
Yes.
to do. And so I was trying to think of an acronym that would represent steps, like pathways out of that feeling stuck or trapped, or thoughts that keep running around in your head like hamsters on wheels, or like what's the actual practical path out of that, and how can we make it so familiar and memorable that it's like muscle memory.
Yes.
So when we get in a place where we feel like our thoughts are under attack, our bodies under attack, our marriage is under attack, or whatever, like, I know exactly what to do first. Here's the first thing. So, combat, the C is confess.
Confess.
Confess your sins. And if you actually did nothing else, you would get pretty far down the
Right.
path with just confessing. Like, what's my part in this? Where am I not aligning with God? What do I need to, you know, realign my thinking to what God has taught? Like, C is confess. The O is a little bit more, probably the most complicated of the 6 steps, but it's like, observe which tactic is the enemy using. Like, is he trying to
Okay.
make me proud? Is he, is he playing on my pride? Is he trying it? Does he want me to feel ashamed? Does he
Mm-hmm.
want me to, like, is he trying to make me feel afraid or
Yeah.
angry, or like, what is it that he is stepping on, provoking? And because I think oftentimes we just don't take time to look at them. And I think it's Pastor Bill Johnson I read who said, "I just want to look at the devil long enough to know how to shoot him." Like, it's not that I want to give him again any undue attention, but like, what's he up to right now? I don't want to be left unaware.
Yeah.
That's
Or
the O.
apathetic or passive. Yeah.
The M is measure. M is for measure the impact. When I sin, when I fall, like, we all have spiritual Achilles heels. When I have, when I fall prey to my sinful nature, and I snap at my child or lose
Mm.
my cool with my husband, or
Oh, we
something that
never we never do that. Never.
I mean, I can justify
Oh,
sinful
for
actions
sure.
in my life,
Yes.
especially when I think I'm willing to pay the price. Like, I'm going to take my chances. That sin that I'm willing to think about or say or do,
Mm,
it's the impact blast is just me, and it's okay with me. I'm willing to take that.
mm,
But the truth is, when I make choices to sin, I'm a part of a whole ecosystem of
mm,
relationships, and
mm.
my lifestyle and my choices are going to impact people around me. And trying to understand what all happens when I fall prey to an enemy attack. What all happens when I am weak and I
Right.
make a poor
Right.
choice.
Right.
So, confess your sin, observe what he's up to, measure what the impact is. The last 3 letters, B, A, and T. B is believe the truth. This is the tool that Jesus used in the wilderness when the enemy was attacking him. he knew his word and he
Right.
used his word,
That's
and he
right.
used it to defy the lies that the devil was whispering to him. So believe the truth. A is aim your fist because we're talking about throwing the first punch. So, what are all the tools I have? Like, I have tools of worship, scripture, prayer. I have the tool of rest. I have the tool of fellowship. I have accountability, like all kinds of tools I have in my tool belt. What do I need to use in this particular moment to get me out of this situation I'm in? That's the A for aim your fist, and the T
And
is
that's
throw the.
such a good reminder that we do have a toolkit full of
Yeah,
tools. Like, I
we do.
love those that you just listed. You said worship, prayer, rest. Those are good reminders. I think you said a few others and I missed them,
Yeah.
but we have been given what we need to fight back. So that's so good. Yes, aim your fist.
Yeah, and then T is throw the first punch. Like, now you have at this point you have momentum because you've confessed your sin. You know what he's up to. You know what the truth is. You understand your tool. So throw the first punch. I mean,
I
like
love that.
you're not going to miss. In
Yeah.
fact, I love to study. I always say I have a Bible crush on Moses, and I love to study the book of Exodus. And there's a passage in Exodus 8 where Pharaoh says to his magicians, "Could y'all come up with a plague as cool as the plague that the God of Moses is doing, because I'd
Yeah.
like our people to understand that we are as strong as the God of Moses."
Mm,
And those magicians come back to Pharaoh and say, all of our power combined doesn't compare to the power that's found in the finger of their God.
come on.
Like, then we have that power in us. So
Come on.
realizing by the time you are at the T and you're throwing that first punch, the enemy has nothing. I mean, he doesn't have enough power left to defeat you. You have all of that spiritual momentum on your own side.
Oh, so good. And I love in the book where you say Jesus is the star of the story. Right?
Yeah.
Like, this isn't about self empowerment and that we have enough to fight it all off in and of ourselves. It's the power we've been given through the Lord. So good, so good.
Do you feel like in your life you've seen moments when you've experienced any kind of spiritual attack?
Yes, I'm actually in a season of it right now. I
Hmm.
feel like so. What you're saying, I'm trying to write notes and keep up with all the things you're saying because I know as I'm listening, there are places where number one, I need to confess some sin, right? Like,
Hmm.
I have been just gonna be real transparent in a season of it's been really comfortable. And so it's
Hmm.
easy for me to not have grabbed hold of what the Lord has for me. I've been in a place of maybe even a little bit of apathy, right? And
Hmm.
so there's some things I probably need to confess, and then there's some tactics that the enemy has been executing in my life that I have not been aware of. So this is so good as you're talking.
Hmm.
I'm trying to learn and ask the Lord for myself as well. You talked about shame earlier, and
Hmm.
shame is one of those things we try to call the enemy out on, specifically in every area, but specifically here with Revelation Wellness, shame when it comes to the design of our bodies and the
Hmm.
things the Lord has done there. We like to call shame out, but shame shows up.
Hmm.
If you go back to the word in the very beginning with Adam and Eve, when they went from being naked and unashamed to then hiding. So shame likes to hang out and hide, but it can wreak havoc. So my question is, how would you see the enemy using shame as a weapon, maybe even specifically in regard to our design or our physical bodies? And then what can we do about it?
I think that's a great question. I've been really influenced by an author named Dr. Kurt Thompson. He wrote a book called Soul of Shame.
Mm-hmm.
And I like some of the things that he teaches on this subject of shame. And mainly, it's a disconnector. I mean, shame disconnects us, it causes us to want to retreat and hide. And we were made for fellowship. I mean,
Yes.
even God is a triune God. I mean, he was
Yes.
made for connection. And it's a, it's, so I like that you talk about it because I think it's the kind of subject that um, it's just hard to admit when we feel shame. It's hard to admit the
Mm-hmm.
things that drive us to shame. And I think
Mm-hmm.
I think the antidote is understanding, like sometimes in Christian circles we talk about the orphan spirit. So my
Mm-hmm.
day job is working with orphan and vulnerable children, and not just orphans have orphan spirit. Anybody who doesn't understand their sonship, the rights and privileges they have as one
Right.
of God's kids, can walk in that orphan spirit. And shame is one of the biggest fingerprints of someone who has the orphan spirit, because this is just a funny little story, but one of my sons is adopted, and we got him the summer before his seventh grade year. So he was 12 years
Wow.
old. He
Wow.
started junior high. He played soccer. And so he had never been in a family before. And we adopted him from a foreign country, and he lived in an orphanage there. So it was like maybe the third or fourth week of school, and he didn't have a cell phone yet. So I got this text from an unknown number, and it said, Tyler forgot his soccer shoes. Can you bring them up after school? And I just assumed it was one of his friends or whatever. And so I went home from work and I found his soccer shoes by the door and I drove him up. He had a game that night. And so there was like an athletic study hall after school. And I walked in, I'm like, hey, here, buddy, you forgot your shoes. And he looked at me and he goes, it worked. And I said, what do you
Oh,
mean it worked? And he's like, I told my teammates I couldn't play in the game tonight because I forgot my shoes. And they were like, don't you have a mom? And he's like, yeah. And they're like, well, just ask her to bring your shoes. And
wow.
he's like, I didn't know that's how that works. I'm like, oh, this is
Wow.
definitely how this works. Like we bring homework, we bring lunch, we bring shoes. Like this is how this works.
Wow.
He had all the rights and privileges as my child, but he didn't
Come
actually
on.
understand how to use
Come
them.
on.
And I think in the same ways, when we become one of God's kids, when we enter into God's family, we have all these rights and privileges. And one
Mm,
of them is we can live without shame. And we're going to spend the rest of our life understanding what our rights and privileges are. But this is how this works. Like understanding who we are in Christ reduces shame. I think sometimes fixating on shame or trying to or even feeling shame about the fact that you feel shame,
right.
that doesn't do anything but double down.
Yeah.
When we put our eyes on who and how God sees us, I think that's the pathway out of
Yeah.
that identifier.
I love that. Do you have a place you would recommend for people to start, right? So, what you just said is we have to understand who we are and understand how the Lord sees us in that relationship. Where do you recommend people start? I mean, obviously the word, but is there a specific passage or teaching or anything you point people to?
You know what? Since I love the Gospels because I just love how countercultural Jesus always was,
Yeah, he
and
was. Yeah.
he wasn't afraid to eat with anyone, talk to anyone,
Yeah.
elevate anyone. He liked kids, he liked women, he liked foreigners, he liked sick people, like all the things that we typically
Right.
might assume were. He just turned all that stuff upside down. So if I want to understand what it's like to be his kid, I think probably understanding more about who he
Yeah.
is a part of is probably a great first step.
Yeah. Yeah. We do instructor training here with Revelation Wellness where we train up fitness teacher gospel preachers. So we send people out to use fitness as a tool to spread the gospel. And we were doing a training call last night and I was talking to all these students that are in training and I was saying to them, know the word, right? Like before we can go out and teach other people, we have to actually know it. But then we have to act like we believe it and actually do
Mhm,
the things it says. So if we're
mhm,
wanting to live more like Jesus, we have to know how he lived. And then we have to
mhm.
practice doing what he did. So such a good reminder for us. Another thing I was thinking about as I was preparing is you talked about the tools that we have access to, the weapons we have. And here in Rev, we say all the time worship is warfare, right? And so
Mhm.
one of the ones you mentioned was worship. So,
Mhm.
why do you think that praise is such a powerful tool in fighting the battles that we face?
Mm. I mean, besides some of the passages, like, inhabits the praises of his people,
Yes.
or Psalm 8 that talks about the power of the praise of children. It has the power to shut the devil's mouth. Or
Mm,
there's a couple of Old Testament stories where prior to the military campaign, they sent out worship bands. I mean, a lot of biblical reasons for us to
yes.
believe it. But just personal testimony, it's a mood changer.
Yeah.
It's an eye lifter.
Hmm.
It's a refocus of
Hmm.
what it is that has my attention. Worship is really about attention.
Right.
It's not about music. It's not about um, it's it's about attention. And so when my eyes go to him, then whatever it is that I was kind of worked up about seems to get put in perspective. And I
Yes.
think um, I don't know, like sometimes in worship, I am like loud and rambunctious. And sometimes in worship, I'm like quiet and reverent. And sometimes in
Yeah.
worship, I'm weeping. And sometimes in worship, I'm hopeful. And I just like that we can be ourselves in worship, that we
Right.
don't have to pretend or
That's right.
posture ourselves. It's just like, it's just a throne room
Mm,
exchange. And I mean, again, I like loud music. I like worship music as much as the next person, but I think we can worship sometimes when there's no sound in the room. I mean,
Absolutely.
we can worship at a walk in nature. We can
Yeah.
worship all kinds of things of worship. And when we're exercising our gifts, it's a form of worship. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, just um, we were made to do it, and so
Right.
that also then ends up feeling really good
Yeah.
that we were made to do it.
Well, and where I was getting ready to go from there is people who are listening who may find themselves in a season where they really do feel under attack or they feel like there's a lot of warfare in their relationships, maybe in their home. I was going to say, what's a practical way to practice that each day, right? But you just listed some of those for us. And I think sometimes, at least for me, I may not feel like it, right? But you go ahead and give him the glory he's due, and my heart shifts in the process. And we were created to worship, just like you said. So, so good. So good. Worship
And,
is
and
warfare.
another tool that I use, speaking of the like, I might not feel like it.
Yeah.
6 years ago, I was diagnosed with the breast cancer gene, so I underwent all the surgeries related to
Wow.
that. And
Wow.
in the aftermath of those surgeries, I was in a lot of pain, and I wasn't reading my Bible very much because I couldn't even really focus.
Mm-hmm.
But it became real obvious real fast that I needed a regular dose of His Word. And during the day, I was fine, but at night, I would wake up with these kind of anxious, catastrophic thoughts,
Yes.
like, "Oh my gosh, we're all dying." And
Right.
so one night, I woke up and I picked up my phone because I wanted to open up my Bible app, and I noticed for the very first time it had an audio feature,
Mm-hmm.
and my phone app was already in the Gospels. So I just hit play,
Yes.
mostly red letters, like mostly things that God said. And
Right.
the narrator was a male. So I was like in the dark on the phone, like it pretty much felt like Jesus was calling me here on
Right.
my phone. And the Bible did what the Bible says it's going to
Yes.
do. It brought a sense of peace into my heart. And so I was like, oh, I want to do that more often. So I started to use the audio Bible like in the morning when I was working, working out or getting ready
Mm-hmm.
or driving in my
Mm-hmm.
car. I just let it kind of I like the way it sounded. I like getting used to the way it sounded. Anyway, months later, I was totally better. And my husband and I on a Saturday morning got in this fight. And we don't even really remember what it was about, but it was a big enough deal that we went in our room so that we could have some privacy away from the kids. And then after a little bit, one of our kids knocked on the door. He needed a ride somewhere. And my husband told us like, I'll be right back. I'm like, no worries. I'm going to be right here. And I was thinking, like, I'm doubling down but as
Yeah.
soon as I was alone with my thoughts, I didn't really like them. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
like how
Mm.
I was sounding. I didn't like what I was thinking.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
had a lot of energy, like a lot of adrenaline going on. And I didn't feel like sitting down to do my Beth Moore Bible study. Like I was like
For
worked
sure.
up, right? And
For
so
sure.
I said to the Lord, I'm not so sure I can come to you, but you can come to me if you want.
Mm,
And I
that's
laid down on
good.
my bed and I just hit my audio Bible. I'm like, come break through my sinful
Right.
nature, break through
Right.
whatever's
Right.
going on here. So 15 minutes later, my husband comes home and he was not listening to his audio Bible. So he comes charging in the room, but poor guy, you can't start yelling at your wife when she's on the bed, like listening to her Bible. So he comes and settles down next to me.
Right.
And the next thing the Bible said was a verse out of Mark. And it said, a house divided against itself cannot
Cannot
stand.
stand. Yes.
And it wasn't like he and I looked at each other like, oh my gosh, you're right about everything. I'm so sorry. But what the Bible did in that moment was lift our eyes and
Mm,
realign us and
mm.
remind us of what's true and
Yep.
remind us of what's important. And
That's right.
all of a sudden, all the things we had been fighting about weren't so important anymore to the extent I can't even remember what it was.
Yeah.
And so, like, tools sometimes actually do the fighting for us. There's a
Mm,
lot of examples where God says, confess your sins, get rid of the foreign gods,
yeah.
and I'll fight for you. And I
Right.
think that's still true today.
I love that. And I love that in that moment, his word was used to remind you that your husband wasn't the enemy, right? Like the
Hmm.
enemy is the enemy. We keep making about other people, but it's really not about other people. And so when you get your eyes back on the Lord, it shifts perspective. Yeah. So good. Okay. So good. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay. So tell me, you've been in ministry for 25 years. What are you
Hmm.
seeing now, Beth, that you did not see 25 years ago?
Hmm. It's a great question. Hmm. There's a story. My husband used to be a history teacher, and he talks about how he used to teach in his classes about the Pony Express, which is the
Mm-hmm.
way in which they delivered mail once upon a time in this
Yes.
country. And they would run those horses really hard from one post to the next. In fact, they ran them so hard that a horse never delivered the mail more than once. They would be immediately retired
Wow.
because they
Wow.
ran them too hard.
Wow.
I think once upon a time, that's what we used to do. We used to run so hard that people flamed out, burned
That's
out.
right. Burnout. Yep.
Words like self-care, that I didn't even know those words
Right.
25 years ago. And I feel like we're doing a better job today than ever understanding um, this is a marathon.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to take care of each other. We have to take care of
Mm-hmm.
relationships. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to prioritize our marriages. We have to,
Yes.
like some of those things, I'm not sure I heard a lot of that. There was a lot of conversation about sacrifice and duty and calling. And I think some of that's very, very important. But I also think we can't lose ourselves in the middle of it. And
Yeah.
I appreciate some of the ways in which people are understanding. If I'm going to do this for a long time, I need to take care of myself.
I love that. And that people aren't sacrificing their families for
Hmm.
that, right? Like that, I think, at least I've heard stories, I'm sure we all have, of kids that grew up with parents in the ministry who grew up resenting everything about it because of all that was built up and the mom or the dad always being gone and serving. And yeah, so Elisa, our founder, is actually out on sabbatical right now because she wants to continue running well with the Lord, right? And so
Hmm.
the ministry, the organization was able to allow her to step away so that she can be filled up and come back
Hmm.
and be ready to run. So you're right. That is so important for people. Okay, tell me a little bit about the ministry that you and your husband founded, the Back to Back ministry, where you serve and care for orphans. So, how did
Yeah.
that come about? What's it look like in your life?
So we had a couple of short-term mission trip experiences, like high school, college,
Mm-hmm.
immediately following college. And one year we were on a mission trip. We were partnering with our church was partnering with a church in Mexico, and they asked us to paint the wall around the church from blue to green, which is fine, except for the year before we'd painted it from green to blue.
Oh,
And it wasn't, we weren't getting swept up into something that the Lord was doing in that city.
yeah, yeah.
And so I was complaining to my husband, like, "Oh my gosh, I cannot do this one more day. Like, I can't, and I can't have these students do this, and God has got to be doing something else." And he just looked at me and he goes, "Do you think there's any orphanages in this city?" Because he and I had visited an orphanage in the country of Albania while we were college
Mhm.
students. I had no idea, but I was like, let's find out. So we left our students in the hands of very responsible adults, and then we jumped in a taxi cab,
Wow.
and we just started saying the word orphan with a Spanish accent, and we found one.
Wow.
We told the guy we had 3 things in our hands, 1 complete day, $200, and 25 high school kids, and what would he do with those resources? And he told us the windows were broken and the kids hadn't had meat in over a year. So the
Wow.
next day we went to remedy that,
Wow.
and my husband pointed out this little preschooler to me, and I told him I couldn't keep my eyes off of her. She was so cute. And he said, "Well, you
Mm.
have to have taken your eyes off her a few times. She's been in your line like 5 times. I don't know any preschooler who can eat that much."
Yeah.
I followed her the next time she came up to get some food, and I followed her all the way back to her dorm room, and I could see she and the other preschoolers were lifting up their beds, and they were putting hamburgers underneath them, like
Mm,
saving them for another
mm,
day. And
mm.
I just kept thinking in that moment, like, I know people who would buy a hamburger for an orphan.
Yeah,
So
right.
that was 1996. We saved our money, and the next year we moved to Mexico for what we thought would be a year. We were double income, no kids, so we saved one of our salaries. That was the start of the work that we do today. And today there's about 350 employees that work in 11 places around the world, and we work
Wow.
with orphans and vulnerable children all the way
Wow.
through to adulthood. And we do trauma training in hundreds of countries around the world. So it's a big operation these days, but it really started with that little girl and her hamburger and me thinking, I bet I know someone who would do something about this and
Mm.
figuring out how to bridge them.
I love that. And I love that, like, your yes, right? It was a yes to something little, but then the Lord uses that for so many other things moving forward, which is so good. Okay, you said so used for trauma. What did you call it?
Trauma training. So,
Okay, so what do you do with them? What does that look like?
yeah, in the beginning with orphans, we just met physical needs because that's what we could see: vaccinations,
Sure,
clean water, protein.
sure.
Then we made sure they knew it was in a spiritual context. Like, this is not because we're great; it's because God loves you. And
Yeah.
then we added a educational component where we were taking kids all the way through college, and we were cruising along for a while at that pace. And we graduated one of our first college graduates, and he was an engineer and came to our house 6 weeks after he'd started a new job. And
Mm,
he was telling us he was going to quit his job. And we were like, why? It's so great. And he's like,
right.
there's this guy and he follows me around everywhere and he's always telling me what to do and he's driving me crazy. And my husband's like, is he your boss?
Yeah.
He's like, yes.
Oh.
And we realized that we had not adequately addressed this young man's issues
Wow.
with authority and men and working in a team and getting feedback and all the things. And so, gosh, that was a while ago now. That was more than probably 12 years ago. And we just started to take a deep dive into trauma ourselves.
Mm.
Like,
Mhm.
who's learning about that? Where's research happening for that? Where's training? Realizing a
Mhm.
lot of content is being passed professional to professional, like given to social workers and psychologists.
Yes.
But we needed content that was going to be good for lay people. And so we created a curriculum. We took the best science research, put it through our faith filter, made it appropriate for lay people, just began to use it with our own staff, saw some pretty remarkable results, and then began to share it. So that part of our organization is called Trauma Free World. And on the Trauma Free World website, anybody can log on and get a variety of training. If you are a classroom teacher or a concerned neighborhood Sunday school teacher, adoptive parent, foster parent, I mean, and any kind of volunteer,
I
we
love
now know
that.
that, yeah, 1 out of every 2 children in the world has experienced trauma. So if you work with kids, it's a good tool to have in
Okay,
your.
say it again.
Mhm,
Traumafreeworld.org or .com, what'd you
exactly
say?
.org. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, everybody write that down. Go check it out. Share it with somebody you know that needs it, which is everybody. So that's
Mhm.
super helpful. Wow. Okay, any last things you want to make sure that listeners know or hear from you today before we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, actually, two little things. I would just say Exodus chapter 10, a plague of darkness. It says that darkness fell so thick on the land, you could feel it. And I feel like sometimes there can be a sense of despair
Mm.
or darkness, like, oh my
Mm.
gosh, this is never going to get better. This
Yes.
is, this is this is terrible.
Yes.
But it goes on to say in that passage that everywhere God's kids were, light was among them. And
Mm.
just that beautiful reminder that everywhere you go, you bear the light of Christ, and
Mm. Come on.
darkness can't overcome it.
Come
It
on.
doesn't matter how thick it is. So definitely want to leave on that little hopeful
So
note,
good. Yeah.
that there's. And then I think probably the only other little passage I would share would be 1 John 3:8 that says the reason the Son of Man came was to destroy the devil's work. And as co-heirs, co-laborers, with God, we now get that
Yeah.
opportunity, privilege, and responsibility. So the idea that we would destroy what the devil's trying to do in our household, marriages, bodies, minds, it's actually very biblical. So feel
Mm.
empowered to go and do that.
I love that. I do feel empowered. After hearing you talk, I do feel empowered and I want to read
Yay.
every word of your book. So
Yeah.
super good. Tell us where we can get your book at, Beth.
Yes, you can get it anywhere that you buy books, Amazon or any Christian retailer, anywhere you want to. You can get it. There's two of them actually. There's a traditional trade book, the way you would think of as a book, and then I really wanted a tool that would help people feel like they were exercising these skills, and so it would look like a Bible study. I think it's called an activation journal or something, but it's really like a Bible study. And it's just called Punch First. So whether you use throw the first punch or punch first, they're both tools to help just become more and more fluent in what it looks like to fight in spiritual warfare.
I love that. So good. Okay, we've got a few questions we like to ask everybody as we
Okay.
wrap up.
Sure.
So, first one, do you prefer coffee, tea, or kombucha?
Diet Coke. Is that one of my
Oh,
choices?
I love that. Okay, fourth category, Diet Coke. So none of those for you. I love it. Okay. Now, I've been hearing a lot about dirty Diet Cokes where people add like cream and lime and different. Do you do that?
well, I mean, certainly, yes. I have seasons every year where I go off of Diet Coke just to prove to me and my body that I can do it, but,
Right.
Diet Coke is my caffeine, form of
Okay.
choice.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Favorite brand of athletic wear. Do you have a favorite brand of athletic wear?
You know what? The Carrie Underwood's brand lately, I really liked, the quality of that and
Yeah.
the way it looks, like how it can go from wherever it is I'm doing that's exercise related to wherever I need to
Sure.
be, where I need to be presentable.
Yes.
Um,
I've seen it. Dick's Sporting Goods is where I found.
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. And then do you have a favorite way that you like to move your body?
Mm, that's a great question. I do a lot of hiking, but, really every night, part of my self-care routine is after dinner, my husband and I go on usually just like a 4-mile walk. It's about an hour, and it's the way we move and download our
I
days,
love
and
that.
whenever that doesn't happen, I can tell it did not happen.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
is good for my mind as well as my body and my relationship. So
I love
that's kind of
that.
a simple little way to move my body, but it's probably my favorite.
For sure. Well, if you ever need a podcast to listen to while you're
Yeah.
moving, Elisa does a Revving the Word podcast where she teaches the Bible while she coaches you through moving. So it could be
Oh.
walking, it could be running, it could be cycling. So good. So we are a ministry that believes sometimes you have to move to work
Mhm.
things out, right? And the Lord meets
Yes.
us in those
Yeah.
places. So, well, I am so glad that you said yes to joining us here today, and having a conversation about things that we need to be more aware of, that are
Yeah.
happening around us. So thank you so much, Beth. We hope that everybody will go out, grab your book, go grab traumafreeworld.org, go there, get those resources. But we're just so glad that you were here. So thanks for joining us. And everybody listening, thanks for tuning in. And we will see you next time. Y'all have a good day.
Thanks for
Bye.
having me.
Thanks for watching, and remember, this video was brought to you by Revelation Wellness Instructor Training Program. Do you love Jesus and have a passion for fitness and wellness? Or maybe you're tired of the roller coaster of obsessing over and neglecting your body, and you know there has to be more to fitness. Let us equip you to lead others to health and wholeness rooted in Jesus Christ through our faith-based fitness instructor training program. Go to our website to learn more and listen to testimonies of people just like you who are bringing hope and healing to their communities as fitness teacher gospel preachers. Click the link in the description of this video and download a packet to get your journey to health and wholeness through Christ started today.